welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is May 30th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Michigan and how they're kind of preparing for possibly a title-defending run. They're definitely going in with a lot of energy, a lot of hope for this upcoming season, but a lot of changes happening in Ann Arbor. So I wanted to get you updated on how they're looking going into this main part of the offseason, really. And then you get into USC. USC has a very, very interesting story that came out the last couple of days that they might have been dodging LSU in this Las Vegas game in week 1. So I wanted to unpack that a little bit and why it doesn't necessarily bode well for the new era of USC by any means. Then we have some early betting lines for the first couple of weeks of the season. I want to break down those, give you my initial thoughts. Obviously, I will not make official picks until closer to those weeks, but wanted to give you guys an idea of where everything sits right now and how it could change before the season starts. Then we'll get to the most important players for the top contenders. We did this yesterday with 5 of the top teams in the country. We're going to get another top 5 teams in the country, and we'll definitely break down who I think is the most important player on those teams. And then we have a Hot Take Thursday, and this might be the hottest I've had on this show, if I'm being totally honest. Definitely one that I'm going a little bit out there for, but I think I'm fairly confident that it's going to happen. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's good for both of us. So again, if you want to use that, that's GSMCpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about Michigan, because there's a ton going into this year for Michigan football. There's no two ways about that. Obviously, coming off a national title, there's going to be pressure on you. And with some new teams coming into the Big Ten, you're worried you might slip a little bit with Oregon coming in, Ohio State coming in. A lot of the talk has been around them. But Michigan is in a really interesting place. A lot of guys found their way out the door. Alex Orji will likely be their starting quarterback this upcoming year. And I kind of wanted to work from a perspective of, what if that guy is for real? What if that guy is able to elevate his game to a place where he can run this offense fairly efficiently? I think some of the things in the offense are better than they were a year ago. I think some things are worse. I think the offensive line has struggled a little bit, replacing a ton of guys on that front. And then you have, I think the running back room is actually better this year than it was a year ago. I think the wide receiver room is better this year than it was a year ago. The tight end room is incredible. So there's a lot of good pieces here for Michigan, is probably the best way to put this. And I think one of the really interesting things when we talk about Michigan is, obviously they're coming off a season that was crazy in a number of different ways. You win a national title, that's really great. But at the end of the day, you have all of the Connor Stallions stuff, you have some other recruiting violations, a lot of stuff that overshadows what you actually were in that season, which was one of the best teams, the best team in the country in a lot of aspects. So I think when we look at this season, there's obviously a ton of questions about how you're going to adapt to the new world of the Big Ten, how you're going to replace those 18 or 19 guys that found their way into the NFL, because that's a big time question. But I kind of wanted to go through a couple of positions here and then just kind of give you my overall thoughts on them, because there's a lot of really good things to work with here. Let's just work from the idea that Alex Orji ends up elevating his game. He's an elite athlete. He's going to be able to run the ball. Sharon Moore and his offensive staff, Kirk Campbell as well, is really good at putting their quarterback in advantageous situations. They did it all year last year with J.J. McCarthy. If they can do the same thing for Alex Orji, plus the thing he can do on the ground with his legs, I think it could be a really, really potent offense, if I'm being totally honest. I don't know if it's going to necessarily be what they had last year, but I think it could be plenty good. So I have questions about Alex Orji. That's all well and good, but I just want to work from the idea that he's going to be solid and give you guys an idea of why the rest of this team is more than fine. The O-line is losing a ton of guys. There's no two ways about that. I believe every single starter, or at least major starter from a year ago, has found their way to the NFL, and that's just kind of the way of things. But you have a lot of guys stepping up into big-time positions. You have a lot of guys stepping up into starting positions, and you added Josh Prevey, who is a fantastic player from Northwestern, was one of the best O-linemen in all of the Big Ten a year ago. So definitely a huge addition there. I think when I look at Michigan and I look at Sharon Moore specifically, they've rarely had a bad offensive line. Now they've had offensive lines that weren't quite, weren't quite to the level that they would like, but they still had great offensive lines essentially since he showed up in Ann Arbor. And I expect this to be not the exact same. The running back room is absolutely elite. You have Donovan Edwards, you have Khalil Mullings. I think both those guys are going to be incredible. I've said it on here before. I think Donovan Edwards is a better running back one than Blake Corum was. So I think that's going to be a huge benefit to their team, especially with a running back or quarterback threat in the run game as well. The wide receivers are probably not necessarily where you want them to be if you're a Michigan fan, but with Tyler Morris, with Samaj Morgan, with some of the other guys they have around there, I think they'll be okay there, especially with some of the offensive, sets that they run. It's not necessarily, the most pass-heavy, aggressive offense in the world, and also having Colston Loveland being one of, if not the best tight end in the entire country, that helps out a lot as well in the pass game. No two ways about that, especially with the quarterback that might not be quite as comfortable making those big-time throws. When you have a 6'7" guy that can run down to the middle of the field, it makes it a little bit easier. And then you go to the defensive side of the ball, and it's outright elite. There's no two questions about that. They have a great, probably the best interior defensive line in the entire country. Mason Graham is a top 5 player in the country, pretty much however you cut it. And then Kenneth Grant is going to be incredible this year, I think, especially because there's going to be a lot of doubles going towards Mason Graham, and that means Kenneth Grant is going to be one-on-one with someone, and I don't think you want that guy one-on-one with a lot of people. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that duo work. The edge rushing did take a little bit of a hit, lost Braden McGregor, lost Jalen Harrell, but I think Rayshon Benny is going to be a guy that really, really steps up into a big-time role. Josiah Stewart is another incredible player for them, so I'm not necessarily super worried about that. I think they can replace and maybe even more than replace the two guys that left at that position. The linebacker one got the biggest boost of the offseason, in my opinion. Jayshawn Barham absolutely is huge from Maryland. He's definitely someone that will fill kind of the Junior Colson void in the middle of that defense, be maybe the green dot guy for this team, so that'll be huge. And the back end is really where the story is. It starts with Will Johnson, obviously. He is the guy that makes the engine go. But then they portaled in a ton of new guys. Now they still have young guys, Makari Page, Jaden McBurrows, that got pretty good reviews throughout spring. But also it felt like they needed to bolster that a little bit more, and they did plenty. They added Wesley Walker, they added Jaden Mangum, they added Amir Hall, they added Ricky Johnson. So they're going to be more than fine on the back end, I think. I have no doubts that Wink Martindale is going to be able to find a really good 5 in that group. And also, when we talk about this Michigan program in 2024, it's kind of like Penn State in a way, where the two people that are the most important to their success are the two coordinators, and I have no two questions about that. Wink Martindale coming down from the NFL is going to be huge. Jesse Minter left after putting together some of the best defenses in Michigan history, and Wink Martindale knows defense. There's no two questions about that, but it is going to be a little bit different. Some of the terminology will be different. Some of the ways that he coaches will be different, so it'll be interesting to watch that. He does kind of come from the similar tree of the Jim Harbaughs, the John Harbaughs of the world, but, there will be ers and ahs here that the players have to get used to for sure. And then Kirk Campbell taking over for Sharon Moore as he moved on to kind of the GM head coaching role. Definitely a guy that I feel really confident in. I think he's been there for quite some time. Sharon Moore is right there with him whenever he needs a little bit of assistance preparing for things. So I'm not necessarily super worried about that fit. Wink Martindale is the one that I'm watching a little bit closer because you have plenty to work with on that defense, but there are some, structural problems that could occur that could make them lose the Ohio State games or the big-time games that you want to be winning, obviously. So Michigan coming off an absolutely historic year, a year that I think a lot of Michigan fans will be talking about for quite some time, and they absolutely should. It was a wild year where they did a lot of things that people did not expect them to do, and they did it while a lot of scrutiny was around him. Now a lot of it was founded and made sense, but at the end of the day, they were able to get through it and, move on to 2024 as the defending national champions. And it'll be fascinating to watch this team unfold. I think there's obviously some holes. You worry about the offensive line a little bit. You worry about Alex Orji's ability to run the offense to the extent that J.J. McCarthy did a year ago. But I think when you look at this team, the bones are really solid. The O-line will have to come along, but I have very few worries about that O-line being at least solid for that team. And then you have Mason Graham and you have Kenneth Grant on the interior of that defensive line. They're going to be disruptive. There's no two ways about that. Then you have Donovan Edwards in the backfield helping out Alex Orji with an incredible run game, I'm sure. You have Colston Loveland, who's going to be a great target for Alex Orji just to make things so much easier for him. Mason Graham is going to be a vocal leader on this team and definitely be someone that pushes everyone to work the way that Michigan has in the last couple of years. And then you have Will Johnson on the back end, one of, if not the best corner in the entire country. Point is, there's a lot of things that change this offseason. There's no two ways about that. Michigan is up against it, and they're walking a bit of a tightrope when you talk about replacing all the staffers they replaced and all the players especially that they had to replace. It's going to be tough. There's no two ways about that. But it feels like as we've gotten closer to the season and people have talked about Michigan and the Big Ten more and more, they've almost pivoted away from Michigan more and more. It's been more about Ohio State. It's been more about Oregon. It's been a little bit more about Penn State from time to time. And Michigan's just kind of sitting there. And I think, I don't think they'll necessarily be quite the team they were a year ago, but they don't have to play the team from a year ago. They have to play the teams that are in front of them, and they're definitely a team that if Alex Orji can, be a competent quarterback, he doesn't even need to be great. I mean, we always talk about J.J. McCarthy. He wasn't necessarily asked to be Superman a lot of the time for this team, and if Alex Orji isn't asked to be that, then he could definitely execute this offense at a very high level. And then when you have the defense they do, you're going to be in a lot of games. So all this to say, really, that we want to write off Michigan. I think we want to write off Michigan because of all the talk around Connor Stallions a year ago, because Jim Harbaugh rubbed some people the wrong way, because of all of that talk. But the reality is this team is still one of the top teams in the country. This is still a team that could make a ton of noise this upcoming year and be in the playoff. Now, do I think they'll get there? I think that's a little bit up in the air. It really does come down to Alex Orji and how he does play this upcoming season. But when I look at this team, there's not a ton of holes. There's worry areas, don't get me wrong, but there's not necessarily areas that I'm outright, thinking it's going to bury their season. So I think they're one of those teams that you don't really know what you're getting with a ton of guys leaving. You don't really know what you're getting with Jerome Moore taking over. So there's a lot of question marks, but I wouldn't just write them off as a team that's going to lose to Texas and lose to Ohio State and maybe lose to Penn State and just kind of fall off into the oblivion. I think they're going to be right there in all of those games and maybe just win one of them. So I wouldn't just overlook Michigan just quite yet on this national title defense. So that's a team that I'm going to be watching obviously very, very closely. Definitely a team that has a lot to gain from this year. If you can show that you're going to be in that national conversation year over year, you have a really good thing going up in Ann Arbor. But we're going to take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about USC. There is some rumors that they were dodging the LSU game in Vegas this upcoming year. Now it's happening. No worries about that. But I want to break down why that is not necessarily the most encouraging thing when you talk about USC in the future for that program.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the things going on with Michigan as they go into a season right after their national title. Definitely a lot riding on this year, a lot of change around Ann Arbor, but I don't think they're necessarily a team that's going to bottom out by any means. But let's talk about USC. And let's talk about how they might have tried to get out of the LSU game. Saturday Down South, one of the big-time college football pages and websites around, has gotten some sources that have said that USC tried for nearly 2 years to find their way out of this LSU game that is going to happen in Las Vegas in Week 1. So there's a lot to unpack, obviously. This is something that apparently started happening or continued to happen when they hired a new athletic director from Washington not too long ago. They were still trying to push for this game to be canceled. They offered new opponents to LSU. Fox Sports even got in on the party and tried to get this game canceled because they didn't love USC kicking off on ABC and ESPN. So yeah, this is a very, very interesting thing. It sounds like Lincoln Riley was very in on the conversation. It sounds like a agent of his that represents Lincoln Riley and Brian Kelly. We're trying to get Brian Kelly on board to change this and to try to get this game canceled. Obviously, it did not get canceled, so we don't necessarily have to worry about this hypothetical too much. But I do kind of want to break this down a little bit because when you look at this at face value, it does not look good for USC one bit, or for Lincoln Riley, because all offseason we have heard about this is the new USC. They're going to be a little bit more hard-nosed. They're going to be a little bit tougher. They're going to make it harder on teams to beat them. They're going to be harder to break. All of these great things that sound really good. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for USC making this change. It's a change that Lincoln Riley and company absolutely have to make for them to be successful. But doing that and then turning around and trying to get out of a game with an SEC opponent is not necessarily the best way to act like you're a big-time tough team now. Now, I do think that there's a little bit of there's an undercursor here that I think we should talk about as we get into kind of this new era of college football. USC does have a really hard schedule this year, and a schedule that they're not used to because you're in the Big Ten for the first time. It's not going to be easy. You still have to play Notre Dame every year, which for some reason Colin Cowherd tried to say they shouldn't, but that's a totally ridiculous statement that I'll try to not bring up anymore. But USC is one of those teams that is taking a big-time step up. When you talk about the competition they're going to play week over week, and it's going to be a tougher schedule. And if you've seen anything over, the past decade of college football, they schedule these games really far out. They scheduled this one before Lincoln Riley was even hired at USC, so he didn't necessarily have a ton of say. I think if they were scheduling it when he was there, he likely would have hoped that they didn't schedule it and try to get that not scheduled. Now, when I look at this from 50,000 feet, when I look at this, I'm saying LSU is going to win this game, and they're going to win this game by a ton, because if USC at any point in this time, if USC, whether it's Lincoln Riley, whether it's some of the coaches, whether it's the administration, maybe some of the players were not as into this idea as it might seem, that's going to be a problem. When you step out on that field and you look across the field and you see LSU, they're big bodies. They're an SEC team that is going to be able to throw you around a little bit. Now, it's not the normal LSU team that we're used to, but that O-line is going to be dominant. There's no two ways about that. That D-line, I think, will come along a little bit better than some people are thinking right now. But USC going into this game with even a sniff of fear is a problem. And LSU just got that. LSU and Brian Kelly, you can best believe the second that they're getting ready for this game, this is going to be brought up. And they're going to say, they didn't want to play you. They were scared to play you. Now go show them that they were right to be scared, is essentially the only message you have to give LSU right now. And it's a thing that I think might continue to happen as we get further and further into kind of this power conference and everyone else type of model in college football, because a lot of these schedules are really tough. If you've looked at Florida's schedule, it is a meat grinder. It is insane what they have to go through in the SEC this upcoming year. So what is the motivation going forward for Florida to schedule some of the out-of-conference games, or for USC to schedule some of the out-of-conference games they have in the past? So that is a worry of mine. You want these games to be a part of the early weeks. I think a lot of us, when we're looking at the early slates, there are a lot of great games, don't get me wrong, but these are the games that you're really, really excited for. This game, A&M Notre Dame, Georgia Clemson, all of the games that really define the opening weeks are the ones that are a little bit weird, are the ones that are out of conference and big-time names and big-time programs, and they get you really excited for the season, get you really into the season. So it's one of those things that you really hope does not go away. And I know that a ton of other schools have one scheduled for 2027 and 2028, so it could be interesting to see how those kind of develop in time. But USC obviously did not help themselves by any means by letting this get out or by doing this in the first place, because at the end of the day, when you look at what USC is going to have to do in the future, they can't shy away from these games. That's just the reality. They're going to play a number of LSUs throughout their Big Ten schedule, and hopefully in the future when they get into the playoff and do some of the things that Lincoln Riley wants to do with this team. So you can't shy away from these teams. You can't run away from any of these teams, because it's going to get thrown back in your face, and you're going to have to go to your guys right before that game and act like nothing happened. Act like you're fully ready to go. Act like you're not scared of this team, but a lot of evidence would show that you're a little bit scared of this team, or at least you're a little bit scared that they might affect your chances to get in the playoff. And that's obviously a huge worry. I think when we got into this new playoff, I think a lot of people assumed that you would schedule more out of conference games because you have more losses to work with. You might as well bolster that schedule if you can. But the reality is, if you have, let's say 2 losses to work with, let's say 10-2 is kind of the low moniker for a playoff team. If that's the case, you don't want one of those to come before you get into the SEC or before you get into the Big Ten slate. So this is a worry that I definitely have. I think it's definitely something that we're going to have uniform scheduling to kind of fix. We're going to have to make it a requirement that you play another Power 5 team early on in the year, and we're going to have to make it a requirement that you schedule a certain number of Power 5 teams or a certain number of Group of 5 teams, and no FCS teams. Please, no FCS teams, but that's a totally other debate for another day. I just think when I'm looking at this and all off season, you're trying to talk yourself into USC, and I was one of those people that I think Lincoln Riley's a fantastic head coach. I think he can do things on the offensive side of the ball that not many other people in the business, whether it's college or NFL, can do. I think he is fantastic with quarterbacks, is one of the best quarterback developers I've ever seen. The problem is his teams have never had edge. They've never had that juice that when you get off the bus, you are never scared of a Lincoln Riley team. Not that they weren't great teams and they didn't have some dudes on them, but they never really struck fear into a team before the game started. They need to be that team going forward. Period. End of story. If they want to compete in the Big Ten, if they want to be a playoff team, if they want to win a national title, you have to be a team that is a quote-unquote a get-off-the-bus team, where the second you jump off that bus and the players see you, their heart rate, bumps up a little bit, gets a little bit faster, and they get a little bit more nervous about what this afternoon has in store for them. So I think when you look at USC, there's things to be optimistic about. I think they're changing their ways. I think they're pushing towards kind of a new order around there where they are a little bit tougher. They are a little bit more hard-nosed. But when you look at this compared to what we've been told all offseason, it's not necessarily the same thing. In fact, it is the polar opposite of what they want to be. So hopefully Lincoln Riley was not quite as integral in these conversations as it made it seem. Hopefully this is something that he's come around on and they're fully ready to go for that game. But if I was a betting man, and I'm not so much, but if I was a betting man, LSU would be my pick, and I would absolutely hammer it. They are 6.5-point favorites right now, and I would be shocked if USC didn't show up to that game a little bit flat, a little bit nervous, and all of that talk gets to them just a little bit. So I think this is going to be one of those games that's going to be fascinating to watch. It's not necessarily the best game of the weekend. I think Texas A&M Notre Dame kind of takes the cake there, if I'm being totally honest. But you also have, this game is going to be huge. It's going to be standalone. I believe it's on the Sunday, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe on the Monday, but I believe on the Sunday. So it's going to be one of those games that's going to be fascinating to watch, not only because these are two teams that are going to be really interesting this upcoming year, but also when you have the dynamic that this one will going into it, it's going to define LSU or USC's season probably more than LSU's at this point, because they got to show up they got to show up ready to go. They got to show up and really be a team that is aggressive, really be a team that is on the front foot and doesn't shy away from this challenge, because if they lose, and if they lose badly, it's going to be an aggressive 24-hour news cycle. I'll say that. But it's going to be fascinating to watch this one unfold. Obviously, you're not really sure how much behind the scenes really happened. So I don't necessarily want to bury USC too much on here, but I do think when you look at what USC wants to be and what this entails that they are, there's a big gap there, and it needs to be closed as quickly as possible, but we'll obviously be watching that very closely, and when that game comes around, be watching it incredibly closely. But we were just talking about some betting lines. We were just talking about, LSU being favored by 6.5. Well, I want to get into some other games that are right around that LSU-USC game. We're going to get into the first couple of weeks of the season, give you guys some of the early lines, where they sit right now, and how I kind of feel about them. Now, I am not much of a betting man, so I don't want to hear anything with, if you do bet these, don't get mad at me, but we'll definitely get to that right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about that USC and LSU matchup and how USC might have been trying to duck that matchup a little bit, in week one, and definitely not necessarily the best look for that USC program right about now. But let's get into some betting lines and who I like early in the football season. We have some great matchups, week 0, week 1, week 2. We'll get to a couple of them, obviously not all of them, because there are so many lines that I think are going to shift or think are going to change, but do want to give you guys an idea of where the big-time games sit right now, and definitely how I'm kind of feeling about them. Now, as I said, I am not a betting man. If you do bet these, do not get mad at me. If you bet these and get them right, though, give me all the credit. I'll take all the credit, none of the blame. I'm all for that. But let's get into this and talk about all of these crazy lines. So it starts off in week 0. I think we can all agree that we are looking very much forward to that FSU Georgia Tech game. There's no two ways about that. Cannot wait for that game to get going. And I think it's only about 87 days out, if I have my math correct. But Florida State is currently favored by 13.5 points, so just a touch under 2 touchdowns there over in Ireland, and this one's going to be fascinating to watch. I think when you look at this game at face value, if you look at the two rosters, Florida State wins by probably about 21 points, right? I don't think there's any question about that, but when you look at, they got to travel to Ireland. When you look at all the transfers that came in for Florida State and are still trying to get their feet wet with the offense and everything like that, and you look over at Georgia Tech and you have Haynes King and you have Buster Faulkner on the same exact page, and that offense being one of the highest scoring offenses in the entire ACC a year ago, it gets a little bit more sketchy, I guess. Now, the Florida State defense is going to be incredible. Don't get me wrong. I do think they're going to be able to at least slow down this Georgia Tech team, but it's going to be really hard to stop them because they do such a good job of moving the pocket, of getting Haynes King out on the edge and getting the ball out of his hands quickly, which obviously kind of at least neutralizes a pass rushing to a certain extent. Doesn't necessarily get rid of it entirely, and especially against a team like Florida State, it's going to be impossible to get rid of it entirely, but it does help it kind of subside a little bit and let you kind of get into the flow of the game a little bit more. So when I look at this game, I think I'm having a little bit of trouble because Florida State is the better team on paper. There's no two ways about that. Florida State would win this game if it was in Atlanta, if it was in Tallahassee, if it was in, Timbuktu. It doesn't matter. Oh, well, maybe not Timbuktu, to be fair. If it was in Kalamazoo, Michigan, they would win it. That's probably a better way to put that. But with the travel, with all of the different variables going into this game, it feels like this is a game that is going to be low scoring. It's going to be a game where you got to make a couple of plays, and that's going to be about it. I think the defenses are going to play really well in this game. and I expect it to be a relatively tight affair. Now, with that 13.5, it's a little bit sketchy, don't get me wrong, where if Florida State just scores one touchdown, this game is, entirely blown open, and someone's won their bet, someone's lost their bet, but as of right this second, I would lean towards Georgia Tech covering that line. I think they have the ability to come out really fast. I think they can score with a lot of different teams, and let's just say DJ comes out of the gate just a little bit slower than you would like. It's definitely a game that could be a lot closer than some people might think. But let's move back over to America for a second here, and let's move to week 1, and let's talk about Georgia. Same exact line for Florida State Tech. They are favored by 13.5 over Clemson, and that one is in Atlanta. This one's a little bit tough. I do think Clemson is going to come out of the gates really fast and aggressive. I think they've heard all the talk this offseason, and they're really ready to kind of make a statement. All that being said, I think a lot of things could go right for this Clemson team, and they could still lose the game by 2 touchdowns, if I'm being totally honest. I think, Cade Klubnik could take another step. Bryant Wesco could have a great game. But at the end of the day, Georgia is just going to be too much for this team. I think Georgia definitely wins this game. Now, the question is, do they win it by 14 or more? I don't know. It's definitely a really, really tough game to pick. I tend to lean that they will, just because when I look at this UGA team, since that SEC loss, it felt like every single day was the most important day to them. It felt like every single practice, every single game, especially that Orange Bowl game, it felt like everything they did has been totally geared towards making sure that never happens again. And that is something that they are really, really focused in on, especially with, a lot of really good teams, joining the SEC and having to play Texas and a lot of the really big things they're going to have to do later in the season. I just think Georgia's going to come out in this one and really assert their dominance again and show that they are the top team in the country, at least at this very moment, and really show that they're not going anywhere, I guess is the best way to put it. So I would take Georgia to win this one by 14, 21, something like that, because when I look at Georgia right now, it's just the gap between them and Clemson is too big at too many positions. But let's look at Miami. They are favored by 3.5 at Florida. This is not necessarily the line that I thought we were going to get. I thought we were going to get something like Miami -1, like a kind of a pick'em type scenario, because when I look at both these teams, I don't really know much, if I'm being totally honest with you. I know that Graham Mertz is going to be a good quarterback. I know that Florida has a relatively solid offensive line. I know that Trey Wilson is going to be a great player. For Miami, I know that Xavier Restrepo is going to be there. There's no two ways about that. I know that Damian Martinez is going to be a good player, even though he is coming over from the transfer portal. Cam Ward, I have full confidence in, but you don't really know exactly what heights he's going to hit until he gets on the field. So Miami on paper, I would lean towards being the better team. But Florida also has the quarterback that's coming back for a second year and an offensive line that's going to be really good. And they have a lot of things that are going in the direction on top of playing in the swamp. So this is one that I really wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, if I'm being totally honest with you. I have no beat on this one. I think it's very possible that we see this shift all over the place before this game starts. I think I would lean Florida to cover. I think I would lean this game to be a very, very close, hard-fought game. But man, I can't make a decision because neither of these teams make much sense to me. Neither of these teams I know much about. I tend to believe that Miami's going to be the better team, but I'm not sure about that. There's a lot of moving parts there that I cannot guess, to be totally honest with you. But let's move on to Notre Dame and Texas A&M. A&M favored by 1 at home against Notre Dame. Notre Dame, obviously one of the big-time teams coming into this year in the entire country, so definitely one to watch there. And I think one of the big things here is I don't know what Riley Leonard looks like yet. He was not fully healthy throughout spring. He has not taken a ton of snaps. We haven't heard a lot about him. So I'm a little bit nervous about where he kind of comes out of the gate, I suppose. And especially when you're starting in Kyle Field, it could be a lot tougher than he wants it to be. Also going up against his former head coach in Mike Elko, which is an interesting little tidbit in this game. A&M feels like they've had something this offseason that they haven't had in a very long time, which is essentially very few eyes. You talk about Texas, you talk about Georgia, Ole Miss, Missouri, Alabama, all of the other teams in the SEC, and then you get around to Texas A&M and say, yeah, maybe they could make some noise. But I think that's how Mike Elko likes it. I think he wants to, work in silence, work in the dark, and just kind of surprise anyone when they finally take the field. So I think when you look at this at face value and you look at this, maybe if it was a neutral site, you take Notre Dame. But with Kyle Field, with A&M, getting a little bit disrespected from the crazy year that they've just had, I think I might lean A&M to win this one. And I don't really have much of a reason for it, to be totally honest with you. I'm picturing in my head Mike Elko getting that first big win, everyone getting a ton of excitement around A&M, and maybe it not being the full year that they want it to be, but at least coming out of the gate really fast and making some fans very excited about this upcoming year. But let's move on to week 2, and let's talk about Texas. They're favored by 3.5 at Michigan. We just talked about Michigan. They're going to be a very, very tough out. There's no two ways about that. That defense is going to be incredibly hard to score on. Now, if you can spread them out, you can do a little bit better, and Steve Sarkisian does an incredible job of spreading defenses out. So that is a huge benefit for Texas going into this game. I think going into the Big House for the first time is going to be something to watch. I think they're very glad they don't have to play this game in November, because that would be a huge advantage in Michigan's direction. But I do think this is going to be one of those games where, kind of like the Bama game last year with Texas, where it's a good game, they're battling back and forth, but Texas just always has their nose in front. And then towards the end of the game, they kind of just pull away with maybe just one big touchdown like they had to A.D. Mitchell a year ago at Bama. So I tend to think they'll win probably by around 10. And obviously, this is going to be a hard-fought game. I think probably a relatively low-scoring affair for the most part. But when I look at Texas, it just feels like they have more answers than Michigan does for the most part. But then let's look at Colorado and their big-time matchup against Nebraska. They do play North Dakota State in Week 1, which is a game we will absolutely break down because I am very interested in how that one goes. But Colorado going to Nebraska. Nebraska favored by 6.5 points. Last year, Colorado was up the whole game. They pulled away late. It was kind of close at times. They were up 13 at halftime. Nebraska scores a quick touchdown to make it look a little bit closer, and then it was pretty much all Colorado from then on out. So this Nebraska team is better than it was a year ago. This Colorado team is better than it was a year ago. So I think it's going to be a really, really fun matchup. When you look at why Nebraska lost that game, with all due respect, it was one guy, and it was Jeff Sims. And they have changed that. Dylan Raiola is going to be, this is kind of his introduction to the college football world. And definitely a lot of people will be watching this game very closely. I'm sure a lot rooting for Colorado to lose in this game. And I tend to believe that's the way it's going to go. I think Nebraska is just more solid. I think their bones are just better. I think when you look at the two line of scrimmages, Nebraska's going to win those battles at least 9 times out of 10. I understand that when you look at the rosters, Colorado they definitely have the best 2 players. They definitely have a lot of the elite talent. But when you look from a depth perspective, when you look from a physicality perspective, it all goes Nebraska's direction. On top of all that, getting them at home, I would lean the Cornhuskers in this one. And that would be a really good win for my Matt Rule and getting this season rolling the right direction. So those are some early takes on those lines. Obviously, I am fully at my discretion to change on a whim. I don't necessarily think this is the way that I'm going to go for all of these games. Also, these lines could move very, very quickly, but we definitely got some very interesting ones throughout this week, and I definitely wanted to cover them just because it gives you an idea of where everyone's sitting right now. I think maybe some people thought that Florida State line would be a little bit bigger, or maybe that Texas A&M line would be flipped, or maybe the Miami line would be flipped. So definitely a lot of interesting things there, but those are my takes early on, and we'll get back to that once those games start to come around. But we're going to take our third break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the best teams for the top contenders. I did this yesterday with some of the top teams in the country. I took another 5 teams. We're going to do Ole Miss, LSU, Utah, Penn State, and Michigan today, and we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the early betting lines. As you can see, we definitely had some very interesting ones. Texas favored by 3.5 at Michigan is quite an interesting one. A&M being favored over what is likely one of the top 5, top 6 teams in the country, and Notre Dame is another one. But let's jump into the most important players for the title contenders this upcoming year. We did Georgia, Texas, Oregon, Bama, and Ohio State. That was the 5th team. So the top 5 teams that I have up top of my top 5 teams in the country. And now let's go a little bit further down the path, but not far by any means. And let's go to the next group on this list. And let's start with Ole Miss, and it's all about Chris Paul Jr. This guy is super important to what this team is going to be this upcoming year. I think when you look at him at face value, you know, there's so many big-time players on this Ole Miss defense. There's no two ways about that. I think when you have Walter Nolan, when you have Princely Umanmielen, when you have so many different guys, I actually put in Walter Nolan here for a second before switching my way over to Chris Paul Jr. So I'm definitely someone that there's a lot of people that need to step up. But whenever I look at a defense that has a lot of moving pieces, that has a lot of people that need to step into bigger roles, I always look at for where the green dot guy is going to be, where the leader of that defense, the center of that defense is going to be, and I think it's going to be Chris Paul Jr. I think he's going to be hugely important to this team's success on the field, but also I think when you look at some of the other guys on this team, there are younger guys that could absolutely make a big-time leap this upcoming year, and when you have a guy that's played as much good football as Chris Paul Jr. has, I think you only benefit from that. So Suntarine Perkins is someone that I'm watching very closely to just become a little bit more polished, I suppose. He has elite athleticism, can do remarkable things on the football field, but I think if he was a little bit better at diagnosing plays, was a little bit better at using that athleticism, not just, you know, as a fail-safe, but using it the correct way and kind of channeling it the right way, would definitely make him a just remarkable player for Ole Miss going forward. So I think when you look at this Ole Miss team, the pieces are there. There's no two questions about that. They did an incredible job in the portal, adding all the guys that they needed to add, doing some of the things that they needed to do. But the reality is, you got to bring them all together. And usually, you know, you would lean on the defensive coordinators to do that in practice, but once you get on the field, it's going to be up to whatever guy is getting that voice in his ear, whatever guy is the communicator, and I can't imagine they would look any further than Chris Paul Jr., a red shirt junior, played a lot of football, SEC football at Arkansas, so I would lean that that's the guy that gets everything in order, and if they are a really good defense, that could be a guy that you look to as maybe the reason for them being as good as they are. So that's a fascinating guy to watch. Another linebacker that I'm watching very closely is Harold Perkins. He is someone that, to me, this one was an absolute layup. When you look at this LSU defense, there's not a lot of dudes. Now, there's good players, don't get me wrong. I think Javian Toviano is going to be an awesome player this upcoming year. I think Javian Suggs is going to be a great player they brought in from Grand Valley State. But the reality is, it all starts and ends with this guy. If he can be an elite player, they can be a really good defense. If they don't put him in the situations that he, you know, was put in a year ago, he can be very successful, and this team can be a really remarkable squad. And I think people, including myself, to be totally honest with you, kind of forgot how good this guy was in his freshman year, when he had a defensive staff that put him in position to succeed and put him in the places where he needs to be, which essentially is kind of wherever. You can put him wherever you want, but also there are right ways to use him. There are definitely ways that you need to utilize him in the field, and I think Blake Baker is going to be incredible at doing that. So when I look at this LSU defense, you know, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of worry. There's a lot of holes, and there's a lot of players that you don't really know where you're going to get from. Harold Perkins is a guy that I feel pretty confident as long as you put him in the position that he needs to be put in, he's going to succeed, and he's going to do really remarkable things, and I would not be surprised by any means if he was on an All-SEC team at the end of the year, possibly the first All-SEC team this time next year. So he's someone that I think LSU's defense right now, I think, is not going to be great. I do think it'll be passable. Now, if Harold Perkins can be the player that, you know, is inside of him and unlock all of his ability, they could be a team that could contend for the SEC. That's how much of a difference maker this guy can be, especially at that linebacker position. So I think he's going to be fascinating to watch. The ability is a piece of this puzzle. The leadership of all these guys that are coming in or young guys that are stepping up is going to be huge as well. So I think when we look at LSU, you look at the defense, obviously, first and foremost, but Harold Perkins is really the guy that is going to make this defense go one way or the other, if I'm being totally honest. So very, very fascinating player. One of my favorite players in the entire country, if I'm being totally honest. But let's move on to Utah, and let's talk about Dorian Singer. This is a guy that is very, very talented. I think there's not a lot of questions I have about the Utah defense, just because Kyle Whittingham is in that room. I don't worry about teams in Utah having a good defense because the way that he's been going about business has been ironclad on the defensive side of the ball for quite some time. So I'm not really going to question him. I'm not really going to say that they need any one big-time defensive player to step up because they've always been incredible about, adapting to circumstances and putting guys in position to succeed and doing all the things that you need to do on the defensive side of the ball. Now, when you look at the offensive side of the ball, you have a couple of worries, and I think they're much less than you had probably a year ago, especially with Cam Rising being out. But even beyond that, I think I had more worries about this offense than I do right now, and I think a big reason for that is Dorian Singer. When I look at the receivers that Utah has had over the past, 5 years, I don't think any of them come close to what Dorian Singer can be. He is someone that I think is remarkably talented, has transferred a couple of times in his career, was at Arizona, then USC, now over at Utah. But the reality is this kid can play, and he can do really, really remarkable things on the football field. And it sounds like him and Cam Rising already have a very good rapport passing the ball. So he's one of those guys that I think when you talk about the Big 12, you talk about Tatoria McMillan, you talk about Isaiah Bond, all of these remarkable, that's not a Big 12 receiver, you talk about a lot of remarkable receivers in the Big 12. I think Dorian Singer could be the best of the bunch. I think he could be a guy that totally busts the door down and is right next to Tatoria McMillan as one of the all Big 12 players at that position. So I think he's going to be fascinating to watch. I think he could be the difference between them just, going to the Big 12 championship to winning it and going to the playoff and possibly winning a playoff game in that time. So I think he's a hugely important guy. I think he could take Utah from great to elite this upcoming season, depending on the season that he has. This next guy is a little bit different. He comes from Penn State. It's Caden Saunders. Now, Caden Saunders is not going to be the wide receiver one over there at Penn State. Julian Fleming will absolutely be the guy that is the go-to one for this team, but when you talk about Penn State, there is a ton of new stuff. You have new coordinators, new guys going off to the NFL, guys coming into the program like Julian Fleming. So there's a ton of moving parts, but the wide receiver room is by far the most worrisome on this team. I think comfortably, I think Penn State fans would tell you that for sure. Losing Keandre Lambert-Smith really put a wrench into this because going into the year, Julian Fleming at the 1, Keandre Lambert-Smith at the 2, Caden Saunders at the 3, it's not necessarily, Ohio State level or Texas level or anything crazy, but it is a really solid group, and it's a group that could definitely get you a number of different places, especially if Andy Kotelnicki can get them open and put them in great positions. So I tend to think that was going to be an okay setup. Now, Keandre Lambert-Smith is now an Auburn Tiger, so you have to deal with Caden Saunders taking a step up into that wide receiver 2 role, and he's going to be hugely important for this team. They can't just lean on Julian Fleming, partly because he's not necessarily the biggest body. He's not necessarily a guy that can take all of the hits in the world and keep moving. So you're going to need to spread out the ball, and you're going to need to go to the tight ends. They have a couple of very talented guys there as well. So this passing game will be multiple. They'll have tons of running back passing game. They'll have tons of tight ends involved. But at the end of the day, you need wide receivers outside that can make plays. And Caden Saunders is a guy that has not quite hit the ceiling, I suppose, that Penn State fans had for him, but the reality is he really could this upcoming season and be a huge reason that they maybe make a run at the Big 12. So it's going to be really fascinating to watch this one. I think you have big-time questions about this wide receiver core, but if Caden Saunders can make things happen this upcoming year, I think a lot of that would go away. And then let's finish it off with another wide receiver, why don't we? Let's talk about Tyler Morris over there at Michigan. This is all about Michigan being at a position where you lose Roman Wilson, you lose Cornelius Johnson, you lose two guys that are hugely important to what you do, mostly because they know exactly where to be and when to be there. They had this ability to always be open, to always have, a fail-safe for J.J. McCarthy to go to, and not having that is absolutely huge. Now, Tyler Morris is a guy that could absolutely step up into that void, I suppose, and definitely be a guy that a lot of people are shocked by this upcoming year. I think when you look at Alex Orji and you worry about his throwing ability, that's definitely not his asset coming in. You need a go-to guy. You need a guy that is going to be sure-handed, that's going to be a great route runner, that's going to do the things that you need him to do, and also, when you get the ball in his hands, can do special things. So I think when you look at this Michigan offense, it's going to be a lot of running the ball. There's no two ways about that. They're going to be able to run the ball, but I do think this pass game likely falls a lot on the shoulders of the receivers to make plays after the catch for Morris and Morgan and a lot of other guys that they'll have contribute here and there. Colston Loveland, another piece of this, that definitely will be a big-time part of this offense, but they need an alpha. They need a guy in that wide receiver room that is going to be the go-to guy no matter what, and I tend to think that is going to be Tyler Morris, and I think honestly, he could be better than the two guys that just left. It just might take him a little bit of time to get there. So, very, very fascinating players. I think all of those guys will have so much to say about what their teams can do this upcoming season. But we're going to take our last break here. And when we come back, we're going to get into a Hot Take Thursday. Frankly, I think this is the hottest one that I've had on this entire show since I've started it. We had one around the ACC title game that is going to be a little bit hard to sell, but I'm going to do my darn best right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the most important players for the title contenders this upcoming year, but now it's time for a Hot Take Thursday, and this one's a little bit of a doozy. I do not think Florida State or Clemson will be in Charlotte at the end of the year, and that's insane. I fully understand that. That is definitely going out on a limb. That is definitely something that the limb could snap under me. I fully believe that is definitely a case, but I'll get to why I think that. I'll break down both of those teams and then get into some other teams that I think could definitely make some noise in this conversation. So let's start with Florida State, and let's break down what this team is right now. So you bring in DJ, you bring in Malik Benson, you bring in Roydell Williams. All of those guys are really good players and definitely could be big-time players for them in the future. Could definitely be guys that you're watching make remarkable plays for them as the season goes on. But I think when you talk about a lot of this stuff, when you get into some of the weeds of this stuff, Florida State has done an incredible job of building out this group, right? They've done an incredible job of building out a transfer portal class that pretty much year over year is going to be talented, is going to be tough to deal with. But also, when you look at Florida State right now, last year it felt like they brought in grade A players from the portal. They brought in Keon Coleman a couple of years ago. They brought in Jared Verse a couple of years ago. It just felt like they were bringing in players that were outright game changers, no two questions about it. They were going to be big-time players for them. Now it feels like they're bringing in grade B players. And it's not necessarily that these players aren't good. They're definitely players that could get up to that A level and definitely could be big-time players for them. But I don't know. You look at DJ Uiagalelei, you look at Roydell Williams, you look at Malik Benson, and I'm not confident that any of those guys are the one at that position. I think DJ is going to be the one, but I don't necessarily have quite as much love for him to be the guy that they need him to be, I guess is probably the best way to put it. And then you have the Florida State defense is going to be good. I don't have many doubts there. I don't think there's any question about that. And it's going to be tough to beat them because you're going to have to score a ton of points. There's no two ways about that. But also, when you look at this team, I'm not necessarily sure if they're going to be able to score a ton of points. I'm not sure they're going to be able to do some of the things they were able to do a year ago and be explosive on offense and have Jordan Travis with his legs stretching out defenses and doing remarkable things. And all of that stuff kind of combined, you can do as much as you want on defense, but if the offense isn't making it happen, and especially if DJ is giving the ball away the way he did the past couple of years, you're going to have a problem. That's just kind of the plain simple truth there. So I think Florida State is good. I think they're going to be one of the best teams in the conference. I just worry that there's going to be a couple of games where this offense comes out entirely flat and it costs them a chance to go to Charlotte. But let's go into Clemson and give you guys an idea of what I think about them, because this one is not quite as much a matter of seeing holes in the roster and worrying too much about specific position groups. It's more about just the energy around this team. I think when you look at the last two seasons, you had a really, really rough year the first time, and you got to the ACC title even with a rough year, so gives you an idea of what Clemson is at right now. But the reality is you have so many different things to kind of factor into this conversation. Garrett Riley and Kay Klubnik were never quite on the same page a year ago, and they absolutely have to be if they're going to avoid what they did a year ago and going 9-3 and missing the ACC title game and not being the team that they wanted to be by any means. Also, I do think this offense is going to benefit from a guy like Bryant Wesco at wide receiver, but also, if your expectation is to have a freshman wide receiver lead your be your go-to guy and lead you to an ACC title game, I wouldn't love that bet. I think Bryant Wesco is a fantastic player and will be a great player for quite some time to come, but the reality is he's not necessarily, you don't necessarily want to lean on a freshman wide receiver is probably the best way to put it. It was the same reason why Texas went out and got all the receivers they did. Jonte Cook's a fantastic player and definitely could be a big-time player for them, but he'd only caught 8 passes in his entire college career up until that point. So you don't really know until they get on the field, and I'm a little bit worried about that. And the biggest one for me is the back end of this defense took a big-time hit. You lost Andrew Makuba, you lost Toriano Pride Jr., you lost Nate Wiggins to the NFL draft, and they kind of just stayed pat. Now, they have really good players in that room. They have A.J. Terrell's little brother. They have a ton of really good talent. There's no two ways about that. When you're at Clemson, you're going to have talent. But can you match that level that they had last year? Can you get even better than they were last year? Because that wasn't necessarily the strength of that team a year ago. So I think it's going to be one of those things where kind of like Florida State and that offense kind of sputtering at times. I think the same thing could happen to Clemson, first of all, but also I think the back end of this defense could just get torched a game or two by, Cam Ward or by maybe DJ, I don't know, but by someone, and definitely make this defense look a lot worse than it really is. So I have, maybe they're a little bit niche worries. Maybe they're, sky is falling type worries where it's not really going to be that big of a deal. But I think when you look at this ACC schedule and this ACC conference going into this year, there are tons of teams that are ready to take that crown. Not necessarily on the same level as Florida State and Clemson from a roster perspective or from, a history perspective, obviously. But there are tons of teams that are right there. I think when you talk about this conference, you obviously should talk about Miami. Miami is going to be the biggest threat here. There's no two ways about that. They're plus 450, to win the ACC this upcoming year. And some of the things they did in this offseason are obviously things that Clemson had no intention of doing this offseason with bringing in some of the portal guys, but also it feels like they brought in grade A portal guys where Florida State brought in grade B. And it's not that, there's this massive gargantuan gap between the two, but it feels like Miami, attacked that a little bit more aggressively and did a little bit more, I guess, hard work, a little bit more grinding to get to that point. So I definitely think they're going to be a fascinating team to watch. In fact, let's look at some of the ACC odds here in the top, I believe, 7 teams here. You have Florida State up top at plus 280, obviously. You have Clemson right there behind them at plus 310. But then you have Miami lurking right there at plus 450, as we just talked about. Definitely a guy or a team that could make as much noise as really anyone in the entire country. They could win the ACC, they could go to the playoff, they could do some things that a lot of people are not expecting them to do and maybe not be ready for Miami to do. Then you have Louisville and NC State right there kind of clumped together at plus 600, plus 700. Two teams that I definitely think could hit the ground running this year. Now, there's a little bit of worry for me around these teams because you're bringing in a new quarterback. Grayson McCall played really, really good football at Coastal Carolina. I think he will carry that over, and I think he'll be a good player for them. Tyler Shuck, I'm not quite as sold on, but definitely when you have Jeff Brom on that staff, he does incredible jobs with quarterbacks and definitely is someone that can put him in positions to succeed. So I'd expect him to at least be competent. And then when you look at some of these other pieces that these teams have, it feels like they're a dangerous team to play. You never want to get them away from home. You never want to really get them in general because any given Saturday they could pop up on you and not only beat you, but probably beat you by about 14 points, depending on the way that things go. So I think those are two teams to watch. And then some kind of longer shots, but I have a really good reason to believe in these teams. Virginia Tech and SMU. Virginia Tech at plus 1,400, SMU at plus 1,800. And they have something that none of the teams in front of them do, which is an experienced quarterback that has been in that system. Now, Cade Klubnik has been in that system, but I wouldn't necessarily call him a veteran or someone that has been through the fire quite as much as I would want him to be up until this point. Kyron Drones has. Preston Stone has. Both those guys are going to be hugely important to the ACC this upcoming year, and they're not going to hand you games, which is probably the biggest thing in this upcoming year for the ACC, where you have a lot of teams that are dangerous. You have a lot of teams that could make some noise, and you'll find that a lot of teams that find their way up to the mountaintop are the teams that don't create problems for themselves. They don't get a lot of penalties. They don't have a lot of picks from their quarterbacks. They don't have a lot of turnovers or mistakes, basically. And I think those are two teams that absolutely could fit that mold. So whether you're, Florida State, I know, has to travel to Dallas to play SMU. When you do that, you got to be really careful because going to Dallas, first of all, is something that Florida State is probably not very used to by any means, but also SMU is not going to play any games. They are fully ready to come into this conference and kick the door down and become a team that is going to be reckoned with for quite some time. So that's a game I'm watching very closely. I think Florida State has Miami and SMU away from home. Two games that are going to be super important to whether or not they find their way into the ACC championship. Clemson has Florida State at Florida State and Virginia Tech away from home. So a couple of the teams we just talked about could be the ones that throw a wrench into this entire work for these two teams. So overall, I fully understand this is crazy. I fully understand that these two teams are going to be the class of the conference going into it and likely have a very good chance of one of them at least making the title game. But it feels like more this year than pretty much any other year in the ACC, at least recently. There are tons of teams that could do it. There are tons of teams that could clip their wings in week 5, week 7, whatever it looks like, and ruin their chances to get into the ACC title. And I am looking at the ACC more and more closely, and the more I look at it, I think we're going to have some type of tiebreaker scenario at the end of this. I think there's going to be maybe 3 or 4 2-loss teams that you're going to have to figure out how they fit with the tiebreakers and the head-to-head and everything in between. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. I'm not going to make a pick right now because I feel like that would be a little bit irresponsible. I have one in my head that I really want to pick, but I'll leave that alone for the time being. I think if the football gods are ACC fans in any way also, there's no way that Florida State and Clemson are making this as they're about to leave the conference. So that might have factored into this just a little bit hoping the football gods are on the ACC side and my side in this scenario. But it'll be fascinating to watch this conference unfold. I think them and the Big 10, or Big 12, are the two most interesting conferences in the entire country because you got no idea who's going to come out of there. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that one unfold. I think a lot of people will likely throw this back in my face around November, but at the end of the day, this is what it's all about, right? But that'll do it. That'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. We have your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on all the social pages: Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. We're all over the place with a ton of great people doing great work across every single sport you could think of. So if you need wrestling, if you need soccer, if you need baseball, we have you covered over here. So no worries about that. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.